A few days ago I went to Bletchley Park, and obviously I went mainly for the history. You know, the code breaking, World War II, Alan Turing, the bomb machine, Colossus, and all that kind of thing. But I also went because of my interest in artificial intelligence. I don't mean they were secretly developing chatbots in the 1940s at Bletchley Park, because clearly they weren't, but information, computation, pattern recognition, pushing the limits of technology, well, all that's there. Plus, and I think this is a really important thing, the race to build machines capable of doing things that humans couldn't do quickly enough on their own. Walking around Bletchley, you can feel the beginnings of a very familiar relationship. Humans handing over certain kinds of thinking to machines. And 80 years later, we're still doing it, just on an unimaginable scale. This is Layered Future, and today I'm reflecting on what I took away from my day at Bletchley Park. Enough of the intro, let's dive in. One of the things that hits you immediately when you arrive at Bletchley is the sheer physical size, the scale of computation in the 1940s. Take the bomb, it's enormous. Rows of rotating drums, motors, wiring, and metal. A machine that weighs around a ton, but not a computer as we know them today. It's a machine that was created to perform a very specific task, to help search for possible enigma settings, to break codes vital in winning World War II. Now compare that with a modern smartphone, something that fits inside your pocket. In actuality, trying to compare the computational power of these two vastly different machines is quite difficult. As I said, the bomb didn't work like a modern computer. It wasn't sitting there performing billions of floating point calculations. It was a specialised, logical search machine. But in my mind, that makes the comparison all the more extraordinary. One of the most advanced information processing machines of the 1940s filled a vast, huge physical space. Whereas today, an unimaginable amount of computational firepower fits perfectly in your hand. And yet we barely think about it. We take it for granted. But computation was once scarce, expensive, physical, and really quite difficult to build and use. Whereas today it's everywhere, and despite the frustrations we all feel, understandably, when a TV show buffers or a file won't download, computers are, comparatively speaking, really easy to use and available to billions of people across the planet. But you know, there was a part of Bletchley that really interested me more than anything else, and that was the story of Bill Tutte. Tutte was a mathematician and codebreaker working on the Lorenz cipher, a system even more complex than Enigma. Unfortunately though, he didn't have access to the machine that created the encrypted messages they were trying to break. So he couldn't take it apart or study its mechanism. He couldn't learn about the nuts and bolts of the machine. He just had intercepted messages, and that was it. So he started writing patterns from the messages they intercepted onto squared paper, dots and crosses, again and again, for a very long time. He was looking for patterns, repetition, and structure, trying his best to reconstruct an invisible machine only from the traces it had left behind. Incredibly, he eventually succeeded. Bill Tutte was a very clever guy. But we should stop for a moment to think about that process and what happened. Back then, for this particular problem, the most powerful pattern recognition system available was the human brain. An exceptional brain in the head of Bill Tutte maybe, but a brain nonetheless. Today, the computers we have in our pockets that we call smartphones could process enormous quantities of this kind of data almost instantly. The computer hardware inside them could be used to search for correlations, repeating structures, and statistical anomalies. In fact, if programmed to do so, the hardware inside your smartphone could find patterns too subtle for a human to ever notice manually. So in many ways, that may be the biggest change of all. We've gradually moved more of the search for patterns into machines themselves. And today, machines do this for far more than decrypting information. They do it to help us run the global civilization we've built. Because in 2026, computers aren't just incomparably faster, they're vastly more capable. My trip to Bletchley also made me think about something else that I find really fascinating, and that's the power of constraints. When they started out, the people working at Bletchley didn't have the technology they needed to do the job. They didn't have unlimited computing power or the modern electronics we take for granted today. A lot of the time, they didn't even have access to the machines they were trying to understand. They certainly didn't have unlimited time, and I don't need to tell you that the consequences of failure were enormous. So they were forced to work around the limitations that they faced. And as a result, they invented, improvised, and found shortcuts. They looked desperately for ways to make impossible problems solvable. And this particularly interests me because I know that restrictions don't always prevent innovation. In fact, often they shape it. Years ago, when I was doing my master's degree in graphic communication, I explored the role of restriction in creativity. And one thing became really clear: unlimited choice isn't always useful. Quite the opposite, it can hold people back. Give someone endless money, resources, and time, and progress can become slow and predictable. But give someone boundaries and a deadline, and they're forced into being more inventive. As a creative educator, this obviously interests me, but it's also enabled me to see something similar happening in the AI race today. You're no doubt aware that the US has restricted Chinese access to some of the world's most advanced AI chips. The obvious intention is to slow Chinese AI development, and yet Chinese companies continue producing remarkably capable AI models. DeepSeek, Kimi, and others. They're working with different constraints. Less access to certain hardware, different infrastructure, and different commercial pressures. And I think those limitations may be helping to push development in different directions. Certainly more efficient architecture and better use of available compute, but also different approaches to training and inference. Look, I'm not saying that Bletchley Park and the modern AI race are the same thing. Clearly, they're not. But in my mind, there is a clear link. When the goal matters enough, restriction doesn't necessarily stop progress. It just alters the kind of progress that you get. What fascinated me most about Bletchley Park wasn't really how old and primitive those 1940s machines looked when you got close to them. It was how familiar the problem of technological development felt. Back then, humans had more information than they could realistically process, so they built machines that could help them. Then for a long time, computational machines handled repetitive work, but humans still found the patterns and decided what mattered. But since then, computers have gone on to become increasingly useful at finding patterns themselves. And today, we're building systems that can find patterns we didn't explicitly tell them to look for. Systems capable of finding relationships across quantities of information that no human could ever process by themselves. To me, that's a remarkable rate of progression in just over 80 years. Bill Tutte stared at dots and crosses on squared paper, but today neural networks can find patterns across vast mountains of data that a human could never hope to process. The tools they used in the 1940s are very different to the tools we use today, but there's a thread that connects our situation and theirs. Because we keep reaching the limits of what human intelligence can practically do, and then we build something to push beyond those limits. Bletchley Park wasn't a single birthplace of artificial intelligence, but it's an important part of that story. Just walking around it, you can see the beginnings of something extraordinary. The beginnings of a new relationship between human thought and machines. That's why for me, Bletchley Park felt so relevant to what's happening now. Because 80 years later, we're still asking the same basic question. What happens when machines can do more and more of the thinking on our behalf? As always, thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you again in the future.